Okay. Let people join, but we will start. Let me introduce first the program and the professor Pawan Sinha. We have been doing this program pretty consistently since a year or so. Or it shoot up during the pandemic because the online platform allowed us to connect with world-class scholars at their own ease, and we could. So the idea of the program is to bring in people that have excelled in they are leaders in the field, and they have essentially motivated interdisciplinary research, connecting diverse ideas. So the past speakers have included luminaries in the field, mind-brain sciences like Michael Posner and many others, Ray Zakhanov. And University of Hyderabad is an institute of eminence now under the new categorization of top research universities. Probably the only second university apart from other one in the Government of India scheme, which allows us to develop our approach to research and global connections more dynamically. And it also therefore motivates both the faculty and the students to really internationalize their thinking and scholarship. So I think this sort of program helps bring new ideas and is part of the mandate in general. And it is also a university that particularly emphasizes cutting edge interdisciplinary research. And coming to the center where I teach currently, Center for Neural Cognitive Science is a decade-old center, part of the School of Medical Sciences, which is a new school of the university. The center offers a master's degree and a PhD program. And many of you who have been students or others, they would know the curriculum is cutting edge in the sense that it offers really prepares you to take up research in mind-brain sciences. So let me introduce now to today's speaker, Professor Pawan Sinha. Professor Sinha is a distinguished researcher in the field of vision science, probably, and is currently or has been in MIT for a long time, MIT Center for Mind and Brain Sciences. And he has done groundbreaking work in demonstrating both neuroplasticity and other mechanisms of vision over a period of time now. And he also has been conducting a lot of grassroots level research on vision and deprivation of vision because of several socioeconomic factors. Project Prakash, for example, is pretty well known globally. And Professor Sinha has won many awards, needless to say that I enumerate them here, has been a fellow and a recipient of multiple awards. So we thought that he would be a very good speaker in this series of talks, because vision essentially is one of the well-researched areas, and a lot of theories of mind and brain have stemmed from what we know about vision, both in neuroscience and cognitive psychology and more other newer subfields of mind-brain sciences. Professor Sinha's current research deals with processing deficits in autism, and he may shed some light on that maybe during the talk. So I welcome all of you, and I hope that this lecture would generate questions. And let me tell you that these talks are archived in the YouTube channel of the University of Hyderabad. So many of you who might not be able to attend today would get a chance to see the lecture and connect with Professor Sinha. And that channel receives a lot of views, obviously. So with these words, I welcome Sir again, and we would have liked you to be, maybe in future you would be a guest at the center and the university later, but nevertheless, this is a good beginning. So we look forward to your talk.
Thank you very much, Professor Mishra. It's such a pleasure to join everyone here. Thank you for the invitation to be a participant in your seminar series. Vaishnavi, thank you for arranging all of the details for today's event. I was telling Professor Mishra that even though I have visited Hyderabad a few times, I've never had the pleasure of coming to visit the University of Hyderabad. So I do very much look forward to an occasion in the future when I can come and visit the campus and meet several of you. I'm currently based in Cambridge, US, not Cambridge, UK, and it's about 11:45 p.m. So it's an unusual experience to be giving a talk at close to midnight, but it's I welcome this experience. Makes it more memorable for me. So as Professor Mishra mentioned, my lab focuses on visual processing. But many of the themes that emerge from a study of vision, we believe cut across boundaries. Those ideas don't just apply to visual processing, but apply more broadly to other kinds of sensory processing, and perhaps even beyond sensory processing. They may have relevance for understanding other aspects of brain function. And the ideas that I'll describe today quite succinctly fall into that camp, that even though those ideas emerged from a study of vision, we believe that those ideas may have broader relevance. And I'll mention one of those linkages beyond vision in the talk. So let me start with a simple game. And because this is a reasonably small group, I invite you to, as I go through the simple exercise, I will invite you to try to recognize the image that you will see on your screen. So the image will start out in a completely incomprehensible state. I don't think any of you will be able to recognize the image in the initial state, but then as we progress through the sequence, hopefully there will come a point when you will be able to tell what that object is. So at that point, just unmute yourself and speak out as to what you think the object is. And don't wait to be completely certain. Feel free to speak out your guesses. So with that, let me share my screen. Okay, so hopefully you can see this strange black and white set of splotches. Okay, so here we go. I will now step through the sequence of images for you to try and recognize.
A dog, it's an animal.
Okay, good. So that's a guess. Let's just keep going down the sequence. I'm not going to tell you whether you're right or wrong, but let's just keep looking at it.
Is a map of Europe?
Sorry, Professor Mishra?
A map of Europe.
Map of Europe. That's very creative. Again, I'm not going to say, but
okay.
Interesting guess.
I can see an eye. Eye is visible.
Oh, excellent. Wow, that's quite remarkable. People typically don't get that early in the sequence.
Okay.
Can people see what that might be?
I'm still getting. I can see
the face. I think
That's the
it's
face.
It's a face. It's a face.
Exactly. Exactly. So here are the eyes. If you can see
Yeah,
my
yeah.
mouth, yeah,
Yes.
and the lips and the hair of the boy. So it's quite remarkable that you are able to recognize that this collection of splotches constitutes a face, and we can
It's a
just
baby. Yeah.
yeah,
Like
a
a boy.
young boy. Yeah.
A boy. Yeah.
Yep. Okay, and I'll tell you what point I'm trying to make, but basically what I'm trying to get you to appreciate is how remarkable your visual capabilities are, that you can recognize these objects even when the images are highly degraded. Let's try one more, and then we'll jump into the talk. So here we go. So again, feel free to guess what this might
It's a dog again for me.
be. Very good. That okay. That's quite remarkable that you were able to see that.
Kind of
that
a dog. Is it
Yep.
poodle?
It's so let's see.
a dog with its mouth open.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. So again, you are doing something quite remarkable, or your brain is doing something quite remarkable. This image has an effective resolution of maybe 8 by 8 pixels. It's really tiny, and yet your brain is able to use that very limited information, and it's able to arrive at the right guess or the right answer. And this ability is one of the foundational abilities that we possess. Being able to make sense of our world with very limited information. This applies not just in vision, but in audition, in touch, even in language. We are somehow able to work with very limited information. And that is one of the big questions that my lab is interested in, and many other labs are interested in as well. How do humans come to possess these impressive perceptual generalization skills? We have seen some images of dogs, we've seen some images of faces, but in very different circumstances. And yet somehow we are able to take that experience and generalize to highly degraded instances of those objects. How do we do that? So we can generalize across different resolutions. We can generalize across different kinds of color content. I could have taken away the color of images and you would have no problem recognizing what the objects are. I could even shift the colors. I can give the images really bizarre colors that you've never seen those objects have before, and yet you can recognize what these things are. I can introduce noise, or I can even just preserve the contours and take away all of the rest of the information, and yet your brain will be able to do a remarkably good job in recognizing these objects. So that's one of the questions that we are after. How do we generalize so broadly and so well? The other question that my lab has been very interested in is this. And this question might seem quite different from the first question. This is the question of development. Why does human development, specifically perceptual development, unfold in the very systematic way that it does? So each one of us has gone through a progression in our perceptual capabilities, and though that progression is pretty much the same across different humans. So is there a reason why there is that consistent pattern of unfolding of perceptual development across people? The reason I bring up these two questions from amongst the many others that I could have mentioned here is that not only are these two interesting questions in their own right, and they're important questions just by themselves. What's of particular interest to us is the possibility that these two questions are actually related to each other. So the proposal that we have been thinking about is that the way we develop and the particular progression that our perceptual system goes through is in large part responsible for the later generalization capabilities that we exhibit as mature observers. And we call this idea the butterfly effects butterfly effects in perceptual development. This name, as I'm sure some of you, if not all, can already intuit. So the notion of butterfly effects comes from chaos theory. Edward Lorenz, who was a key researcher in this domain, he suggested this, this fancy term, this colorful term, to indicate that in a complex system, he was thinking about complex systems like weather systems. In a complex system, an event early on, like the flapping of a butterfly's wings in, say, the Amazon rainforest, can, over time, set in motion certain phenomena that can amplify different kinds of processes and eventually have major consequences, like a hurricane in the North Atlantic. So this was the proposal that Edward Lorenz had made in the context of climate and other complex systems. And we believe that there might be some relevance of this notion in understanding why human perception progresses in the way that it does. So the early stages of human perception may be responsible for the kinds of proficiencies that we possess later. And I will unpack this linkage between the status of early perceptual capabilities and the status of later adult proficiencies in the rest of this talk. But let me start by mentioning who the dramatis personae are in this work, so people who have contributed to this work. It's a really nice team of colleagues. Many of them are students across many different institutions: MIT, IIT Delhi, Tapan Gandhi, and Preeti Gupta. So Tapan was a former PhD student of mine, now a professor in electrical engineering at IIT Delhi. Preeti is now a postdoctoral fellow, also at IIT Delhi, and several other students, also at EPFL in Switzerland. These individuals span an amazing age range from 20 to 95. It's really inspiring. So the 95-year-old is Dr. Sidney Diamond. He retired as a neurologist in New York, but then decided that he wanted to devote his post-retirement years to research. So he decided to join my lab. And even at the age of 95, he comes into work every day, and he is a very active contributor to our research activities. It's really inspiring. So we have a diversity of institutions, a diversity of ages, and a diversity of nationalities in this group. So spanning Germany, Israel, Spain, Japan, India, of course, and the United States. So it's been a pleasure to work on this project with such a talented and diverse group of people. So now let me start the story from the beginning. And this story begins with the arrival of this little boy to our lab at MIT. And I have deliberately obscured his identity and the identity of his father. That, by the way, is Sid, the 95-year-old I was just talking about. And that's Tapan, and that's Amy and Evan and Leo. students in the lab. So this is RK. RK was a normally developing child. I mean, most of his developmental milestones were being met, but his parents were concerned that he was having difficulty making friends in school and on the playground. And they suspected from RK's behavior that difficulty in making and retaining friends might be related to the difficulty RK was experiencing in recognizing people. So it was a suspicion. They felt that maybe there was some problem with RK's face recognition skills. And because they had read some news articles about my lab in which we had talked about our studies in face recognition, they reached out to me to ask if we would assess RK's face recognition skills and other visual skills. So of course, we invited them in. So RK and his father came in from Washington, DC. And in learning more about RK, we found that he had a pretty interesting history. So his father told us that RK had been born in China. And right after his birth, he was given up to an orphanage by his parents. So it's not that his parents had passed away, but rather his parents gave him up to the orphanage because RK had been born blind. And because of the one-child policy in China until not so long ago, this was a common occurrence, that if a child were born with some kind of a physical or mental challenge, then the parents would give up the child to an orphanage in order to have a second chance at having a child. So that was the unfortunate fate that befell RK. He was put in an orphanage as a blind kid. The orphanage tried to collect resources to get RK treated. And when RK was 4.5 years old, the orphanage got a surgeon to treat his eyes. The surgery succeeded. RK continued living in the orphanage for another 1.5 years. And he was then adopted by this American family and brought to Washington, DC. And that's where he had grown up till the age of 10. And at that point, he visited us and we had a chance to examine his visual skills. So what we found, consistent with the parents' suspicion, the adoptive parents' suspicions, is that most of RK's visual capabilities were just fine. He had reasonable acuity, reasonable contrast sensitivity, stereo depth perception, and so on and so forth. But he was compromised on face identification. So on tests of face recognition that we conducted, RK had a very hard time. And that made us wonder, why is face identification compromised when these other visual capabilities are not? It was a very curious puzzle. So we looked at the literature for other cases like RK, children who had suffered early blindness and then had difficulty or exhibited difficulties in recognizing people. And there have been cases like this in the past, not too many, but a few. And the dominant explanation for why these kinds of children exhibit face recognition impairments is this. This is a quote from a paper by Charles Nelson, a very prominent child development psychologist. So Charles Nelson says, it seems likely that face recognition reflects an experience expectant process, whereby exposure to faces during a sensitive period of development likely leads to perceptual and cortical specialization. So in other words, the idea is that for face recognition to develop normally, the brain in some early critical window during development, during the first couple of years of development, must receive face inputs. And if it doesn't, then the face processing machinery is somehow permanently compromised. So this, as many of you can already imagine, this is closely connected to the critical periods idea that David Hubel and Torsten Wiesel had also proposed. They had won the Nobel Prize in 1981 for their work on critical periods. So a similar idea is being proposed here in the context of face recognition. But what's interesting to note is that this explanation is assuming some specialness of face processing, because the other aspects of vision that I had just listed, those seem to have developed fine for RK, and face recognition seems to be compromised. So this proposal would say that there's something special. Face processing is somehow specially vulnerable to early deprivation, and the other aspects of vision are not. And this may well be a right hypothesis, but as scientists, we always try to develop parsimonious hypotheses, hypotheses that don't require us to make special assumptions. We want to have as simple a hypothesis as possible. So could there be a simpler hypothesis that does not depend on any domain-specific assumptions, that face processing is particularly vulnerable and others are not? Can we sidestep having to make those kinds of domain-specific assumptions? And as we thought about that, our thinking converged onto this this temporal progression in development. This is the progression of visual acuity. So acuity on the y-axis as a function of developmental age. So 0 corresponds to birth, and then these are the months following birth. So as some of you may already know, at the time we are born, our visual acuity is really poor. So whereas as adults, we have 20/20 acuity, most of us have 20/20 vision, which simply means that at 20 feet, we can resolve a pattern that a typical human being can resolve at 20 feet. That's what the 20/20 fraction means. 20/800 means that we would need to be, if I had 20/800 vision, that would mean that I would need to be at 20 feet to resolve a pattern that a normal human being could resolve at 800 feet. So my vision is 40 times worse than normal human vision. And that's what babies start out with, really crummy vision. And then over the course of the first several months, their vision improves until by about 2 to 3 years of age, they achieve pretty much normal acuity. Now, this has been documented several times. This is a very solid finding. The question is, why does this happen? Why do we start out with such poor acuity and later have better acuity? Here is the answer. The primary culprit in our initially poor acuity is the immature retina that we are born with. And there's a particular kind of immaturity in the retina, and that is our photoreceptors are very fat at the time we are born. And because they are fat, the packing density of the photoreceptors is much worse than the packing density of the photoreceptors when we are adults. It's like having a, let's say, a much lower megapixel camera at birth than what you have as an adult. And that's what's schematized here. So if this is a neonatal cone, notice how fat this is, and this is an adult cone. If you were to tessellate these cones or to pack them together, you would have much fewer neonatal cones in a given area than adult cones. So an adult would have a much higher resolution of sampling than a neonate would. Now this progression from the fat cones to the thin cones, that happens over the course of the first few years, and that's why Acuity registers an improvement. I mean, this is a partial story. I'm oversimplifying the story a bit, but this is the bulk of the story, that the maturation of the retina in large part contributes to the improvement of our acuity. Now, why am I taking you through this? It seems pretty unrelated to RK's story that I started out with. The interesting thing here is that this maturation of the retinal cones happens without regard to visual input. So even in a child like RK, who is being denied visual patterns on the retina because of the cataract that he was born with, this progression is happening. The cones are getting thinner and thinner, and the retina is maturing. So now you can see where this is going. When a child like RK is finally treated at the age of, say, 4 or 5 years, by that time, the retina has matured. So now when you remove the cataract, the child begins to receive visual information on a mature retina. So the acuity that they start out with is much better than the acuity that a neonate would start out with. So whereas a baby would start with really blurry images, a child like RK would start his visual journey with much higher quality images. And indeed, when we looked at the medical records for RK, we found that his acuity right after his surgery was 20/40, which is nearly normal and much, much better than the acuity that a baby starts out with. So this discrepancy led us to hypothesize a second possibility. So instead of the kind of critical periods idea that we had seen, the proposal that we are making is this, that the abnormally high acuity that RK had at sight onset has led to adverse consequences. So this is somewhat counterintuitive. We are saying that too good of an acuity right at the outset of vision may in fact have bad consequences for the developing visual system. And that begs the question of how might poor acuity at the outset help? So if starting out with very good acuity is bad, then what is the benefit of starting out with poor acuity? And the intuition is actually quite straightforward. Don't worry about reading all this text. I can just summarize the idea in pictures. So when an image is quite degraded, any local patch of that image is not going to give you very much information about what that object is. So if you think back to the picture of the blurry dog that you saw, if I had given you just a tiny aperture of that picture, you would not have been able to tell that that's a dog. In order to make sense of a degraded image, you need to have a much larger area of integration. So degradation is essentially forcing you or forcing the brain to expand its spatial region of integration. Whereas if the brain were provided high resolution images right away, then even from the local information, it can assess what that object might be. So there's no impetus for the brain to expand its spatial integration fields. And just to complete this quartet, so that is the image that you were seeing. That's John F. Kennedy, of course. So to this question of why is RK's face identification compromised, we are suggesting that RK may have small integration fields leading to compromised holistic processing and a bias towards local processing. So because RK's visual system was exposed to high quality images too early, it never developed the ability or the need to expand and process images holistically. It's just using a piecemeal strategy for recognition. Now, before we go further, I should mention that you may be wondering that we're building up this whole big case about the importance of early degradation just based on RK's data. So is that, can we reinforce the foundation of this hypothesis? Are there any other cases like RK that also support this idea? And indeed, the work that we're doing in Project Prakash gives us lots of supportive evidence because the children that we work with in Project Prakash have a profile like RK's. So just a brief background on Project Prakash, at the risk of repeating something that many of you might already know. Project Prakash is an effort that merges a humanitarian mission with a scientific quest. The humanitarian mission is to provide treatment to curably blind children, like this boy. Many of these children live in remote rural parts of India, and their parents either don't know that their child has a treatable condition, or even if they do know that the child could possibly be treated, they don't have the means to get the child treated. So the humanitarian mission that Project Prakash seeks to address is to identify these children. We conduct many screening camps in many different parts of the country to find such children and then provide them world-class eye care, surgical care. In meeting this humanitarian mission, we have an incredible scientific opportunity, because you can imagine if a child has been born blind and has spent the first several years without access to visual patterned information, and then immediately after surgery begins to get all that visual information pouring into the brain, we have an amazing opportunity to study how the brain reacts to this influx of new information. How does it learn to make sense of the visual world? So that's what we've been doing for the past several years. And the results have been really, really gratifying. Let me show you one video that some of you may already have seen. This is a video of a little girl who's 11 years old at the time the video was made. Her name is Sumitra. And you will see her pre-surgically and then post-surgically. So pre-surgically, Sumitra's vision is light perception. She can tell night from day, but no more. And we have asked Sumitra to try to find a box of chocolates that we put by the side of the hospital corridor. And you can see that she struggles, as you would expect. And although it seems kind of cruel to be subjecting Sumitra to this challenge, we wanted to document just how profoundly compromised Sumitra's vision is prior to surgery. Next, you see her post-surgery, 8 days after surgery. And as this anecdote shows, it does make a big difference. Surgery really transforms children's lives. We have so far screened over 40,000 children, provided surgical care to over 500 of them, and non-surgical care to many more. And working with these children has given us a window into the process of development along many different dimensions. I'm not going to go through any of these in any detail, but we have been able to look at low-level aspects of vision, things like acuity and contrast sensitivity and motion perception, and also higher order aspects of vision. So even though the story that emerges from these findings is generally a very positive one, that these children are able to acquire significant proficiency over time after surgery, there are some skills that they seem to be compromised on. And harkening back to RK's case, face recognition seems to be one of those tasks, where these individuals, the Prakash children and adults, have a very hard time recognizing people. And this one picture shows one of our earliest subjects. His name is SK. And here SK is looking at a picture of himself with two of my graduate students, Yuri Ostrovsky and Ethan Myers. And I am asking SK what he sees in that picture. And he says that he sees three people. He can tell that they're wearing eyeglasses. So his vision is quite good. But amazingly enough, he can't recognize any of these, even though he has spent several weeks working with Ethan and Yuri. He can't recognize them, and he can't even recognize himself. And this seems to be a story that recurs across the Prakash children. So face recognition seems to be puzzlingly impacted by the deprivational history the children have undergone. Data from other labs also supports the kinds of observations that we made with RK. This is some work from Daphne Maurer's group in Canada. So Daphne works with children who are born with cataracts in Canada. Now, these are children who get surgeries very soon after birth. So unlike in India, where a child could languish for years with their cataracts, with their blindness, in a country like Canada, as soon as the child is detected as having a treatable condition, within a matter of a few weeks, they get surgeries. So children born blind in Canada, if they have a treatable condition, can get treated by the time they are 6 months old. When Daphne then looks at their face recognition performance several years later, she finds that there are interesting differences in their capabilities relative to controls. And I want to highlight one particular pattern of results that she observes. So these children and controls are being asked to say whether these pairs of images are same or different. So what you see here are two pairs. The upper pair has configural differences. So you notice that the features, the local features in these two images are the same, but the mutual distances are different. So here, the lip is closer to the nose than the lip here. The eyes are closer together in the face on the left than on the face on the right. So these are configurally different faces, whereas the pair on the bottom shows featurally different faces. So here the local features between the two faces are different. The eyes are different, the mouth is different. Interestingly enough, children who have suffered a few months of visual deprivation at birth, they are able to perform just fine on the featural discrimination when the task only requires local comparisons, but they perform worse than controls when the task requires configural assessments. So very consistent with the hypothesis that we are proposing, that maybe the global holistic processing system or capabilities are being affected by that early deprivation and perhaps by the onset of high resolution vision. And I'll skip through this finding. But just to recap, our hypothesis is that RK's difficulties and difficulties that other children like RK face in face identification may arise, at least in part, from not having experienced the world in a degraded manner. The typical Acuity trajectory provides that opportunity to most children. So a normally sighted child experiences the world initially in a degraded manner, and that experience puts in place the right kinds of representations that later allow the child to recognize images even when they're degraded, and allows the child to develop holistic processing strategies. So whereas the conventional explanation relies upon a reduction in plasticity, so after the critical periods, the proposal is that the brain simply loses its ability to change. This hypothesis that we are suggesting is that of distorted learning, that the kinds of experiences the person is going through may also play a significant role in determining what kinds of capabilities they would exhibit. So that's the proposal. It seems to be seems to have face validity. Seems to be consistent with the observations from, say, a child like RK, that he had high acuity at the outset and he is exhibiting poor face recognition skills. But we would like to test this idea a little more rigorously. So can we test this idea computationally? And with that goal, we decided to work with machine vision systems that could learn from experience, and the system of choice, at least in the current years, are deep neural networks, which constitute a reasonable model of the initial stages of visual processing. So deep neural networks, and specifically convolutional neural networks, have a series of stages of artificial neurons arranged somewhat like the way the cortical network is set up in the primate brain, in the mammalian brain. With these deep neural networks, what we could do is examine what happens to the receptive field structures in these networks when we train the network with high resolution images, kind of like how RK would have experienced the world, versus with low resolution images, like a normal baby experiences the world. So does that lead to some changes in the internal representations of the deep network? And does it also lead to some changes in performance of the network? This would be one way, one systematic way of going about testing our hypothesis of the beneficial effects of early degradation. So here are some results that I'll go over fairly quickly, and I'll point you to a paper that describes this work in greater detail. So what we find, consistent with our hypothesis, is depending on what kind of image, what resolution of image the network is trained with, so whether it's trained with high resolution images or with low resolution images or intermediate resolution images, that strongly determines the nature of the receptive fields the network learns. So with high resolution images, the network learns these fine-grained receptive fields that focus on detailed edge structures and are small in terms of their extent. Whereas when we train the network with degraded imagery, the receptive fields that are learned by the network are large, and they focus on the coarse structure of the images. And this is, even though at first glance this might seem to be an obvious result, well, what else could the network have done? If it's being presented with high resolution images, it would of course learn to see details, and if it's being trained with low resolution images, it would only encode coarse structures. But on closer or on second thought, this is actually not such an obvious result, because the high resolution images actually contain all of the low resolution information as well. So the network could, in principle, have learned these large receptive fields even with high resolution inputs, but it doesn't. When presented with high resolution data, the network falls into the trap of only using the details. It just does not have the impetus to look more holistically and to construct large receptive fields. And this is very important because this may well be what's happening in the brain, that when presented with high resolution data, the brain simply has no inducement to try to expand its receptive fields. So it falls into the trap of only having this detailed piecemeal processing strategy. I'll skip through these graphs on the right and come to these other plots. Again, I'm not going to go through the details, but give you the bottom line of what are the basic findings. So one of the results that that come out of these computational simulations is that these progressions from low resolution to high resolution and from high resolution to low resolution, even though they show in aggregate the same set of images to the network, they have very different consequences. So the temporal progression seems to be important. The temporal progression that nature has designed for us of going from poor acuity to high acuity, that seems to be particularly well suited for changing the receptive fields to be able to encode large-scale structures, holistic structures. That's one of the results that emerges. Second, even a fairly limited period of low-resolution experience seems to be enough to give us the benefits of holistic encoding. So even though our acuity as babies develops quite rapidly in a matter of a few months, we are already at, say, 20/100 vision, starting at 20/800. But even just those few months that we had with low resolution vision seems to be enough to give us all of the important benefits of that degraded experience. And finally, the low to high progression, the developmentally consistent progression, is better for enhancing classification performance across multiple resolutions. So this developmental progression actually makes the networks better at being able to handle sharp images as well as degraded images. Whereas the other regimens, like only experiencing high resolution images or experiencing high resolution images first and then low res, those are not as good at giving the network this generalization capability. So the inferences that we derive from this work is that one, face processing difficulties in the newly sighted, like in RK and in the Prakash children, may be due, at least in part, to their unnaturally high initial acuity. They're starting out with too high of an acuity, too much of a good thing. And that is perhaps compromising the performance. Now, as a side note, but an important note, it's worth observing that this is not a face-specific explanation. So I talked about the desire to have a parsimonious hypothesis that does not make face-specific assumptions. And this is not a face-specific assumption. All that we are saying is that early exposure to high acuity is compromising holistic processing. And because faces rely especially on holistic processing, they are being affected. But other tasks that rely upon holistic processing, tasks like being able to detect symmetry in the environment, being able to detect objects in noise, those would also be expected to be compromised. And indeed, the Prakash children, the experiments that we're doing now, they do suggest that the Prakash children have compromises in any task that requires holistic processing. The other inferences are that one, the poor initial acuity in normal visual development may actually be a feature of the system rather than being a bug. So it's not a limitation of biology that we don't have good acuity right at the outset, but rather this is a really clever aspect of biological development that we are forced to contend with degraded images at the outset and then go on to high resolution vision. And that puts in place the right kinds of algorithms in our brain. And from the pragmatic perspective of machine vision, this hypothesis presents us with a recipe for making more robust machine vision systems. So if we train our machine vision systems with this developmentally oriented regimen of starting out degraded and then progressing to undegraded, we can expect better performance, better generalization performance from these systems than they would exhibit if they were only trained with high resolution inputs. What are the implications of this idea? Let me mention just a couple. So one implication is that children, normally born children, would exhibit some spread in their initial acuity. So there's probably a bell curve, a normal distribution in terms of the initial acuity that a baby starts out with. So some children, well, many children are starting out at 20/800 vision. Some are starting out with worse than 20/800 vision, and some are starting out with better than 20/800 vision. Now, if our hypothesis is correct, then what we would expect is that these children who are starting out with better than 20/800 vision might actually be at risk for later challenges to the holistic processing. So if we could track children over time, what we would expect to see is a negative correlation between the acuity that they have at birth and, say, the face recognition abilities that they exhibit later. So the higher the acuity, the worse they would be on a task like face recognition. So this would be a difficult experiment to operationalize because it would require working with many babies, many newborns, assessing their acuity and tracking them over several years. But it would be a really remarkable finding if we are able to get at that. If we do find that result, then the obvious implication or the obvious intervention would be this. We would suggest that children who are starting out with overly good vision actually have some external degradation applied. So maybe they are forced to wear blurring glasses in order to bring their vision to the level of a typical newborn. And in order to avoid them falling into the trap of having local piecemeal style of processing. So these ideas, I know that I've gone over them quite quickly. We described these ideas in this paper that appeared a couple of years ago, Potential Downside of High Initial Visual Acuity, and it's freely downloadable from the PNAS website. Beyond visual acuity, the same idea, we believe, applies to other dimensions of vision, like color. So because color is subserved by the same photoreceptors that are also responsible for high acuity vision, the cone photoreceptors, one would expect that color vision for a baby is poor at the outset and then gradually improves. And indeed, that is the case, as borne out by several studies. Babies are initially getting really washed out colors, and then as they age, they begin to see more saturated colors. And because I know that we are running out of time, I won't go through that thread of how the same account initial degradations leading to better performance later, how that applies to the case of color vision. But the bottom line is that here again, initial experience with poor color images allows the brain to process images that have color shifts or even complete removal of color. The reason we are able to deal with grayscale images so well might be a consequence of the fact that we initially started out our visual journeys with very poor color vision. I'm going to skip through all of these slides and get to a domain beyond vision, and that's audition. And I'll conclude with this. So I've talked about the notion of butterfly effects, primarily in the context of visual acuity, and just hinted its relevance in the context of color. But this notion of early degradations being important for later proficiencies likely applies beyond vision. So in the domain of audition, perhaps a similar story applies. But what's interesting to note is that to the extent babies' hearing has been tested, babies seem to have near normal spectral acuity. That is, they can hear high frequency sounds and low frequency sounds about as well as adults can. So at first glance, it seems like the butterfly effects idea does not apply here because babies are starting out with high acuity auditory sensing. Unlike in vision, where high acuity vision is not available to the baby. But we can go a little further back in time. Before the baby emerges into the world, what is the baby's auditory experience like in the womb? This seems like a strange question to ask, but researchers have actually explored the auditory experience of the fetus within the womb. People have made recordings of sounds in the womb of, I don't think they've done so for humans, but in the womb of other mammals, in this case, a sheep. And they have found that the amniotic sac acts as a low-pass filter. So what the fetus receives is a low-pass filtered version of the auditory landscape around the mother. So in the weeks before birth, the baby is being exposed to low resolution versions of the auditory inputs. And then when the baby emerges in the world, then the baby begins to get high frequency inputs as well. Now this low resolution input in audition, why might that be important? Low frequencies in sound carry information about emotion, carry information about prosody. So a lot of the meaning in spoken language resides in the slow variation in the auditory signal. And low frequencies are carrying that information. So this exposure to low frequency sound allows the baby, we propose, allows the baby to develop sensitivity to these slow varying signatures of emotion and prosodic content. And here again, we have done computational simulations of how exposure to low frequency sounds versus high frequency sounds impacts computational systems capabilities, and the results turn out to be very similar to the vision case. So the prediction based on these computational simulations is that if a baby is denied that experience with low frequency sounds, then we would expect that that baby would exhibit impairments in the ability to detect emotional content in spoken language, or the ability to extract prosodic content from a speech sequence. Now, what kinds of babies might experience these challenges? These would be babies who have been denied that period of low frequency experience, and these would be essentially prematurely born babies. So who were born so early that their period when they would have experienced low frequency sounds in the womb, that has been cut short, and they have been placed in, say, a neonatal ICU, where they're being bombarded with full frequency auditory inputs. Amazingly enough, when we have looked at the literature on the kinds of challenges prematurely born children exhibit later on in life, it turns out that they do. They experience challenges in prosodic analyses and in emotional analyses, quite consistent with the hypothesis that we are making. And this has interesting implications in terms of what kind of auditory landscape should be present in a neonatal ICU. Instead of high frequency sounds, these babies should be exposed to the same kind of low frequency sounds that they would have experienced in the womb. So to summarize, we've talked about butterfly effects in perceptual development. I've talked about them in the context of visual acuity, a bit in color, and a bit in audition. But there are many other aspects of perceptual development that might follow the same idea: our robustness to noise in images, our robustness to contours. So it's a very rich area, we believe, that we have an opportunity to mine. And we are especially fortunate that we have access to Prakash children, because they provide a very interesting test bed to examine what happens if these initial stages of development are denied to a child. So, so this whole theme of exploring butterfly effects in perceptual development allows us to bring together three very interesting threads. Very interesting in their own right, but you put them together and things become really interesting. So we are able to study development after deprivation, like in Prakash children. We are able to study normal development, and we are able to study machine learning when we study butterfly effects in perceptual development. So we can ask, why do children with atypical developmental trajectories exhibit specific impairments? We can ask, why does normal development unfold in the way that it does? And we can ask, what kinds of training regimens can help artificial systems gain the kinds of generalization that's exhibited by humans? So with that, let me just thank all of the wonderful people who have been part of our team. This work has benefited from many talented individuals, and we are also thankful for the support that we have received from several foundations and the National Institute for Health. With that, my thanks to you for giving me this opportunity to share this work with you, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Sinha, for a pretty a new way of looking at the interaction between the world and the developing brain, as far as sharpness in vision is concerned. So, of course, many things come to mind from various other theoretical frameworks. For example, affordances, like the way the environment is organized already, and what sort of sharpness it already offers. And then it has a consequence for any neuroplasticity that might occur in the infant brain. Because I was thinking, that is the world sharp enough to begin with? I mean, what do I see? How sharp it is already. But if I artificially make something, more featurely sharper, Will it help the neurons learn, as you were saying, that high megapixel images facilitate learning? But the grossness is probably what is available. I mean, I'm talking about usual objects around, not a designed. One could do an experiment though with it.
I agree. Yes, I think even as adults, even though we are under the illusion that because we can sense the world in such high resolution, we must actually be making use of all of that information. I think the story is quite different, that the brain actually is relying upon the very coarse information in the signal. And this high resolution is really just coming along for the ride. High resolution might actually be used for performing vision at a distance, rather than really making inferences about objects up close. So for the fundamental signature of an object that the brain relies upon, I think resides in the low resolution structure of the object. I think as vision scientists and as machine vision researchers, we have been misled, or we have fallen into the trap of thinking that maybe there's something very special about high resolution vision, when I think the key really lies in the coarse structure of the signal.
Sorry. Essentially, a naive general understanding of all the findings so far from what we would suggest that we really have no kind of attention to get at unique features in short spans of time through which we extract semantics of objects, and we do that pretty fast. If you remember, Christoph and colleagues, 21 milliseconds it takes to arrive at a gist or summary of a visual scene. Of course, I assume that you have encountered that before. It should be part of your lexicon. So there is no way to really have a framework that selective attention to features gets activated to all the details to begin with. But in cognitive psychology, I think it requires learning and control of selective attention and the goals of such control, what exactly you're trying to get at. But as you said, the television sets and the popularity of the media being delivered in extremely high resolution. But that's just one side of our experience, because the rest of it is time-bound and gross, and we are required to deliver first quick discrimination. What is it? What is not? So how all this can fit into a real-world scenario of a brain, vision, and cognition interaction? It's a very, very broad question, but even.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right, that even though we can sense the high resolution structure, the real information that's involved for classification, that we're using for classification, may actually be in the coarse structure. So in an old TV set, the fact that we could recognize all of the objects that were being shown, that goes to suggest that at least for the task of recognition, we don't really need all of this high resolution information. The high resolution information may be used for something else, but recognition seems not to be it.
Just my one last, I do some photography, and in the camera world, designing cameras with maximum megapixel is big deal now. For example, Fuji came out with a camera that is 100 megapixel. Now, in the artistic side of it, many photographers really want to play with it, but they are returning back to the old format, grainy film cameras, having been dissatisfied. The whole idea is that it's okay, but that's not how we see the world. So I would enjoy seeing a picture, even if it is 100 megapixel. Maybe it is okay to pixel pick on the screen, but if I take a printout, it is irrelevant completely. So there is some sort of a dichotomy in our experience of this technology and judgments about them.
Right.
But that's just one field which is the billion-dollar industry. Where
right. Yeah, and I have a similar feeling about paintings. So they are photorealistic painters who go into the minute details of every fine little feature, and they capture that in their paintings. And then there are the impressionists who are just capturing an impression of the scene. And to my eyes, the impressionistic paintings look more beautiful than the photorealistic ones, because what the artist has done is to distill out the most important pieces of information and get rid of the details. And I think that is really the mark of a great artist, to remove clutter, high resolution details, and preserve what really conveys to the brain the identity of the object.
Right. Any other questions from the audience? Please go ahead. And we can't keep him awake for long, so we please be yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'll make it quick. Hi.
Yeah.
Thanks for a great talk. I think the idea that initial high acuity can actually be detrimental in some way, I find that very fascinating. So my question is, in cases like that, where you're saying that holistic processing suffers at a later stage, but we're still saying that the processing of local features is intact, or maybe even better than the other children, right? Who start out with the degraded acuity, like in a normal case. So if that is the case, then I'm wondering, why can't we look at this as a compensatory mechanism where, okay, you're bad at one thing, but you're compensating by being very, very good at something else. So
Yeah.
like, why is it so bad? Like, I'm trying to understand.
No, that's a great question, Seema. So if all of the tasks that we're required to do could be done using local information, then you're right. This is not necessarily a bad strategy. And the child could get by just fine just using local pieces. But if there are some tasks that simply cannot be done using a purely local strategy, then the child runs into problems. And face recognition seems to be that kind of a challenge, where just looking at, say, an eye, or just looking at the corner of a mouth, does not carry enough identity-related information to be able to do a good job in the real world. You necessarily have to pay attention to the configuration of the features. So I think there are some tasks that we are called upon to do that local processing simply is insufficient for. But if we did not have that requirement, then you're right. This wouldn't necessarily have been a bad thing to have happen. We could just use local processing. But just to make an additional point from the domain of machine vision, most of the machine vision systems, most of the deep networks that are currently all the rage. So I'm sure you've seen headlines like Google has a face recognition system that is as good as humans. And now those systems are only using local features, and yet they're producing such high performance. But that high performance can very easily be broken by simple things like you blur the image, and that little bit of blurring of the image makes no difference at all to a human observer. I show you a clear picture of a dog or a blurry picture of a dog, and you're able to do just fine. The deep networks fail catastrophically with those degraded images. And that's because they are relying so heavily on the details of local features that as soon as you remove that, the system falls apart. And this is very dangerous because you can imagine, say, you deploy this kind of a system in automated driving car, and let's say the camera is a little out of focus, or it's raining. So you have degradations in the input image. Humans would still be able to do just fine in those circumstances, but these automated systems would begin to fall apart. So it's important for us to not just be reliant upon local features, but to have a more robust strategy that can deal with these degradations.
But in cognitive psychology, I presume that you must be taking a good amount of interest in the experimental progress in that field.
Mm-hmm.
There is enormous emphasis on featural processing. I mean, human observers doing feature level processing, many kinds of tasks in laboratories. But essentially, the computation, the calculation is on discrimination, which is semantic.
Hmm.
The reaction times do not tell you at all to what extent somebody really achieved a better score on this feature as opposed to that feature. So there is some sort of a confusion in the field, but we go with it. So there is some I will say a comparison with the computational machine learning finding that we, as you have emphasized, they do it well with a clear idea of what it is. But we get away with it because we have cognition, which is more intuitive and probabilistic. Because I saw in your webinar that you have also worked with prediction, and I and my colleague we work in language prediction, particularly how you predict an upcoming word or a phrase, looking at a visual scene. So so there is some sort, I don't know.
Yeah, I think there's some very interesting connections between the notion of prediction and this notion of features versus wholes. In fact, we're exploring one project where we are trying to see whether a visual system, an artificial visual system that is tuned to the local features versus one that can pay attention to the gestalt, they are differently able to learn predictive relationships between entities in the environment and their consequences. So, well, let's say the presence of a dog signals some other thing later in time. So the presence of a dog signals, I'm just making this up, signals the presence of a toy. Let's say it's an arbitrary linkage. So a dog at time 1 signals the presence of a toy at time 2. Now, if your representation is highly specific to local features, then what you might end up doing is you might pick out some local features for dog 1, different local features for dog 2, and yet other features for dog 3. So there's no consistency that you have learned across the instances. Whereas if you had learned the holistic representation of the dog, then perhaps there's a better chance of seeing the commonality across the 3 instances and thereby extracting the predictive relationship. So a more robust representational strategy might allow you to extract the predictive relationships more consistently. That's the hypothesis that we're working with. We don't have any concrete results yet, but we think that this might pan out.
Sir, I just have one more question. It's rather a doubt, I would say. Even, the small children, when they try to read, so reading is also, is it like local processing or, global processing when they try to read?
That's a great question. And I'm not an expert in reading, but a few things that I can mention. One is that by the time a child is reading, so by the time a child is, say, 2 years old, by that time their acuity is close to normal. So they are not acuity limited in terms of their ability to resolve letters. But even though the child has enough acuity to resolve individual letters, their eye movements, and perhaps some of you know this field better than I do, the eye movements seem to indicate that they are not going letter by letter in terms of seeing what words these are, but rather their eye movements are much more on the shapes of the letters. So you could have the envelope, you could degrade the image and yet allow the child to read, even though the degradation might be enough to obliterate the identity of individual letters. So long as you can make out the shapes of the words, you can still do a reasonable job of reading. In fact, there's an interesting demonstration, I think from the University of Cambridge, where they have taken a paragraph, just some news article paragraph, and for each word, they have kept the first and the last letter the same and have scrambled the internal letters. And it's amazing that despite that scrambling, you're able to read this text quite well. So it seems that so long as the rough shape, the size, those parameters are maintained, you're able to do still a reasonable job of reading. So it does seem like there's some amount of holistic processing happening there as well.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Right. I think we should wrap.
I have a quick question.
Yeah, of course.
Can I ask?
Yeah, question.
More of knowing your opinion on this, but I'm thinking from the quantitative psychology literature on, especially on attention studies. So there is this idea that Friedman proposed that object processing is a result of binding multiple low-level features together, and attention does the binding job. So what I'm thinking is it possible that in these children, somehow the binding is not happening, and as a result, the holistic processing does not happen as it happens in children with normal vision? So is it possible that instead they have an attentional deficit? I'm just thinking.
Yeah, that's a great possibility. I cannot deny that that possibility exists, and we haven't looked into the attentional system of the Prakash children. I'm trying to think of how one might initially validate or deny that possibility. So one thing that we notice is that when you have a static image, the child has difficulty in putting the pieces together. But as soon as the object begins moving, that common movement of all of the features of an object, the fact that they're sharing this common temporal trajectory, that allows the child to bind the features together. So there doesn't seem to be a fundamental limitation that the child has in terms of being able to bind these features together. They just need to have the right kinds of cues to tell them that these things go together. So I know that this is not a full answer to your question, but I would think that they're not fundamentally compromised at being able to say whether these n features go together or not. They just have to rely upon more dynamic features rather than static features.
All right, thank you.
Certainly.
I'm understanding the curiosity of Vaishnavi to bring in attention, but the problem with attention is that it's a black hole. I mean, you need to then talk about what kind of attention that is essentially, gluing this feature. We still don't know. There are general theories, and the developmental data on attention doing such is very poor. I don't think anybody has tracked for any length of time in infants.
Yeah, and I think that's a fascinating open area. because just as you're pointing out, attention is a black hole. You can ascribe almost any process to be modulated by attention, and we know so little about its developmental roots.
Not even prominent researchers who have spent decades in studying attention have come up with any solid hypothesis with regard to how features features make objects. Although we have Trisman's model and some other, but as for cognitive psychologists, it's intuitive to bring in attention whenever there is some sort of a mechanistic requirement in an architecture. We say, okay, you have to talk about attention. So let's say we do some attentional testing in parallel to other forms of testing, and we collect some ERP or some sort of data. It is possible that because we have pretty standard ERP components, pre-attentional and attentional and post-attentional and etc., you might see some correlation in some children who are failing to recognize objects both at the local or global levels, but it might become complicated. We need to,
I think this can be a very interesting line of research to try to connect attentional binding with this notion of local versus global processing.
I think we will, we can continue talking this, but I have to keep time in mind, and I can only thank him for his patience and the lucidity with which he talked and explained, and it could go on, but we unfortunately have this time difference. But I'm quite sure Professor Sinha will visit us as soon as we return to full normalcy. And we will host him, and there are many possibilities in the university now to invite distinguished professors and researchers in many capacities. I will get in touch. Also, we have a clear potential to collaborate in because we have access to deaf and autistic populations here in Hyderabad, which will offer a contrast to the population maybe that is in Boston or elsewhere. So I have done some collaborative work with a Badless group on working memory development in bilingual children in Hyderabad. And these results are being published now. So we will probably be interested in talking more. Some of the students, now they know you, they can contact you and.
Absolutely, I would welcome any contacts, and I would love to explore possibilities of working together.
So with this, I thank you for your.
Thank you very much, Professor Mishra.
It is our pleasure all the time, and I thank all the audience. Although it was thin, given the time, probably early in the day here, and we will wind it. We will have the program this year, and I thank everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. All the best for your work.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.